Hey guys, welcome back. Today I'm going to share a story with you, a true testament to the human spirit that might just wash away your worries and give you the motivation you need to keep pushing forward. But before we dive in, please hit that like button. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story touches your heart, make sure to hit subscribe and join our community. Now, to set the mood, why don't you dim the lights, switch on a small lamp, or let a soft breeze from a fan fill the room? Get comfortable. Ready? All right, let's begin. The town of Oakhaven was a place where dreams often withered before they could bloom, tucked away under the relentless, sweltering sun of a harsh summer. In a frail, dilapidated trailer on the outskirts of town, a woman named Sarah sat by the flickering light of a battery-powered lamp, her hands resting protectively over her swollen belly. She was heavy with child, yet her heart was already shattered. Only months before, her husband Elias, a man of humble labor and quiet integrity, had ventured into the city in hopes of securing a future for the child that was yet to exist. He had promised to return with enough savings to fix the leaking roof and provide a warm home. Instead, he returned as a name whispered in grief. A tragic construction accident, a sudden fall, and a final hollow silence were all that remained of him. Before his son could even feel the warmth of a father's touch, Elias had become a ghost, leaving Sarah to bear the crushing weight of a widow's burden in a society that had no mercy for the destitute. 3 months after the tragedy, the world welcomed a boy who would be named Leo. His arrival was not greeted with celebrations or the joyous pride of a family. Instead, it was marked by the oppressive silence of a household draped in mourning. Sarah, weakened by poverty and the relentless sorrow of losing the love of her life, fought a desperate battle to keep the tiny flame of her son's life burning. When she looked into his eyes, she saw a clarity that felt ancient, a depth that seemed to understand the gravity of their circumstance. She knew her own strength was fading, her health depleted by the hardship of providing for 2 on the wages of none. She held him close through the long, cold nights, whispering prayers into the darkness, begging an indifferent universe to be kinder to her son than it had been to her. But fate is rarely compassionate to the destitute. The relentless struggle took its toll, and while Leo was still an infant, a sudden merciless fever claimed his mother. Within the span of a single year, he had lost his world, left as the final fragile remnant of a broken family, adrift in a town that looked upon his existence as an unfortunate inconvenience. As the years passed, Leo grew up in the neglected corners of Oakhaven, surviving on the scraps offered by neighbors who saw him as an extra mouth to feed rather than a child to cherish. He was an orphan of both land and soul, wandering the dusty paths with an air of solitude that set him apart from the other children. By the time he reached the age of 8, Leo had learned the cruel, unwritten rules of his world. He was a footnote in the lives of the wealthy, an invisible shadow cast against the vibrant walls of their prosperity. Every morning he found himself drawn to the gates of the local academy, a fortress of privilege where children in crisp white shirts and polished shoes marched in with heads held high. They carried books that smelled of paper and promise, laughing as they entered a realm of knowledge that remained perpetually out of his reach. Leo would sit on the edge of the curb, his clothes tattered and stained with the very dust he slept upon, watching the gates like a sentry of his own unfulfilled desires. Whenever he dared to approach, the school security would shoo him away with disdain, as if his mere presence were a blight upon their sanctuary. "Knowledge is not for the likes of you," they would scoff, their words sharper than any blade. Yet they could not break his spirit. Even in the face of such systematic rejection, Leo found his own ways to learn. He would press his ear against the outer walls, straining to catch the lessons recited by the students inside. He memorized the alphabet from the rhythmic cadence of the chants and practiced writing letters in the dirt with a broken twig. He was perpetually hungry, not merely for the scraps of food that kept his body together, but for the profound light of understanding that he knew was existed just beyond the wall. He was a diamond buried deep in the grit of a landfill, unrecognized and abandoned, waiting for the day that someone would finally see the brilliance shimmering beneath the grime.
Now that we've set the scene, let's see where Leo's journey takes him. It's in the moments of our deepest despair that life often presents us with the most unexpected miracles. The day was stifling, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer above the asphalt. 8-year-old Leo sat near the edge of the academy grounds, his stomach knotted with hunger, his eyes red from hours of silent weeping. He had been driven away from the gate yet again, the guards' laughter still stinging his ears. He curled into a ball by the roadside, feeling that the world was not just unkind, but entirely empty. He felt the cold realization that he was truly alone. No mother to hold him, no father to defend him, and no future to claim. "Why?" he whispered into the dirt. "Why is the world so cruel to me?" It was in that moment of absolute surrender that a shadow fell over him. It wasn't the harsh shadow of a god, but something softer. Leo looked up, squinting against the glare, to see an elderly man standing over him. He was dressed in a well-worn coat that spoke of dignity rather than wealth. His face was a map of lived experiences, his eyes kind but weary. This was Arthur, a retired librarian who had spent his life surrounded by the wisdom of books, yet now lived a quiet, solitary life in the outskirts of Oakhaven. "You look like a boy who carries the weight of the world on shoulders far too small," Arthur said, his voice as steady as an old oak tree. Leo wiped his face with a grimy sleeve, his pride struggling against his exhaustion. "It doesn't matter, sir. I'm just alone. There's no one left for me." Arthur didn't offer empty pity. Instead, he sat down on the curb beside the boy, ignoring the dust on his trousers. "Loneliness is a heavy burden, Leo, but it is also a quiet space where a person can decide who they want to become. I've watched you for weeks. I've seen you listening at the walls. I've seen you writing in the dirt." Leo froze, his heart skipping a beat. He felt exposed, yet for the first time in his life, he felt seen. "I want to learn," Leo confessed, his voice barely a tremor. "But they say I don't belong there." Arthur looked at the academy gates and then back at the boy. He saw the fire in Leo's eyes, a brilliance that poverty couldn't extinguish. It reminded him of the potential the world so often ignores. The walls of an academy don't make a scholar, and a uniform doesn't make a person. Would you like to learn for real, not just what they teach inside those walls, but how to understand the world and master your own destiny? Leo looked up, hope fluttering in his chest like a trapped bird. "You would do that for someone like me?" Arthur placed a weathered hand on Leo's shoulder. "I have no heirs, no family, and many books gathering dust. I think it's time I invested in the most important thing I can find. From today, you are no longer alone. We have work to do." That afternoon, the boy who sat in the dust was led away not toward the gates of the elite, but to a small, book-filled sanctuary that would become the forge for his future. Leo didn't know it then, but this man, this stranger, wasn't just teaching him how to read, he was teaching him how to survive, how to fight with his mind, and eventually how to lead a nation that had once turned its back on him. The era of the orphan was over. The era of the architect of his own fate had begun.
You know, sometimes life hands you a lifeline when you least expect it. Leo's journey with Arthur wasn't just about reading books, it was about reclaiming his dignity. Let's see how this bond shaped the boy who was once cast aside. The transition from the scorching asphalt to Arthur's small, dimly lit library felt like stepping into another world. The air smelled of old paper, cedar, and the quiet comfort of home. For the first time in his 8 years, Leo had a sanctuary. Arthur's method of teaching was unconventional. He didn't just hand Leo textbooks, he handed him concepts. Mathematics is the language of the universe, Leo, Arthur would say, drawing equations in the dust of the floor, and history is the map of our mistakes. To change your future, you must understand both. Leo was a sponge. Deprived of formal schooling, his mind had become incredibly sharp, hungry for any scrap of knowledge. He studied by the glow of a kerosene lamp late into the night, his small hands calloused from chores, yet graceful as he turned the pages of Arthur's extensive collection. But life wasn't just about books. Arthur taught him the hard lessons of existence, the value of silence, the strength in discipline, and the importance of holding on to one's humanity even when the world is cruel. As years passed, the boy who sat at the curb became a young man with a focused gaze and a quiet, immovable confidence. He didn't just learn to read, he learned to think. He watched the politics of the town, the arrogance of the wealthy, and the systemic neglect of the poor. He saw the cracks in the foundation of the town he lived in. When Leo turned 18, Arthur, now frail and his own movements slowed by time, sat him down. "Leo, you have the mind of a leader and the heart of a survivor. But remember, power without empathy is just another form of cruelty. Whatever you do, never forget the boy who sat in the dust. That boy is your moral compass." Leo faced many struggles during those formative years. He worked odd jobs to support them, enduring the sneers of those who still saw him as the orphan from the streets. There were days of intense doubt, nights of physical exhaustion, and moments where the weight of his past threatened to pull him under. Yet every time he felt like quitting, he looked at Arthur, his mentor, his surrogate father, and remembered that he wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for a different kind of world. His rise was slow, deliberate, and entirely earned. He didn't climb a social ladder, he built his own foundation. He became a voice for the voiceless, a man who debated the powerful, not with anger, but with an intellect so precise it couldn't be ignored. The town of Oakhaven, which had once treated him as invisible, began to listen. He wasn't just Leo, the orphan. He was becoming a force of nature. It's amazing what can happen when just one person believes in you, right? Leo was starting to see his own potential, but the road ahead was about to get much tougher. We're heading toward the climax of his youth, his struggles, his sacrifices, and the inevitable path toward leadership. Before we move on, if you're feeling inspired by Leo's grit, do me a favor, comment growth below. It helps the algorithm share this story with more people who might need to hear it today. Are you ready for the next chapter of his rise? Let's keep going.
You're still here. I knew you would be. Let's dive deeper into the fire that forged Leo into the man Oakhaven couldn't ignore.
The transition from intellectual awakening to real-world application was brutal. Oakhaven wasn't a town that welcomed change, and it certainly didn't welcome it from a boy who had once scavenged for food behind its grandest storefronts. Leo's first act of public resistance wasn't a grand speech or a protest. It was a simple, quiet correction. At 19, he stood in a town council meeting, usually a domain reserved for landowners and the wealthy, and dismantled a proposed tax policy that would have effectively displaced the families in the lower districts. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten. He used the very math Arthur had taught him to show the council with agonizing precision exactly how their plan failed the town's own economic sustainability. The room went silent. The arrogance that usually greeted him turned into a confused, festering hostility. They couldn't dismiss him as the orphan anymore. They had to contend with the fact that he was the smartest person in the room. But change has a cost. The jobs that kept food on his and Arthur's table began to disappear. He was barred from the community center where he sometimes studied, and the whispers turned from pity to threats. One evening, Leo returned home to find their front door splintered. Arthur was unharmed, but his precious collection of books, the map of their shared world, had been tossed into the muddy street, some pages torn, some burned. Leo knelt in the mud, his hands trembling with a rage he had never permitted himself to feel. He looked at the wreckage of the only home he'd ever known. He thought of the boy in the dust, the boy who was supposed to be his compass. "They want me to be a victim, Arthur," Leo said, his voice dangerously steady. Arthur, sitting on his porch, leaned on his cane. "They want you to be afraid, Leo. Fear makes you predictable. Being a leader means deciding whether to mirror their violence or to transcend it. If you fight them with their own weapons, you become them. If you win with truth, you become the architect of a new system." That night, Leo realized that he wasn't fighting for acceptance anymore. He was fighting for legitimacy. He began to organize, not through rallies, but through service. He created a night school for the children of the poor, teaching them to read by the light of scavenged lanterns, mirroring the education Arthur had given him. He helped the elderly navigate the convoluted property laws that threatened their homes. He became a shadow mayor, the man the people actually went to when the official government failed them. The climax of his youth came during the winter of his 22nd year. A major flood devastated the lower districts, and the town council, citing budget deficits, voted to abandon the area, leaving hundreds homeless. The systemic neglect was no longer just a policy, it was a death sentence. Leo stood in the town square. He wasn't the boy who used to sit on the curb. He wore a coat that saw better days, but he carried himself with an authority that stopped the crowd in its tracks. He spoke for 3 hours. He didn't just point out the cruelty of their decision. He presented an emergency infrastructure plan he had drafted with the help of local engineers, utilizing the very resources the town had left to rot. He challenged the town's conscience, and for the first time Oakhaven felt shame. As the sun set, the people didn't applaud, they didn't cheer, they stood up and followed him. They walked toward the flooded district, carrying tools, blankets, and determination. That night, the social hierarchy of Oakhaven didn't just crack, it shattered. Leo stood at the edge of the destruction, exhausted, mud-caked and shivering in the cold. He looked over his shoulder and saw Arthur watching from the distance, a faint, proud smile on his face. The orphan from the streets had finally arrived, not as a ruler, but as a guardian. But he knew, as he looked at the work ahead, that the true challenge wasn't winning the town's attention, it was keeping his heart from hardening under the weight of the power he had just inherited. The rise is rarely about the victory itself. It's about the person you become when you refuse to let your circumstances define your ceiling. Leo didn't just save his town, he saved himself. What do you think was the turning point for you in your own life? The moment you stopped waiting for permission and started building your own foundation? Drop your thoughts below. I'm reading every single one.
You want to know what happened next? Most stories would end with the triumph at the floodgates. They'd paint Leo as a hero, give him a parade, and let the credits roll. But that's not life, is it? And that's certainly not how Oakhaven worked. The weeks following the flood were not a honeymoon period of gratitude. They were a minefield. By proving the town council wrong, Leo hadn't just saved the district, he had humiliated the powerful. Power, when cornered, is never gracious. Leo quickly found that while he had the hearts of the people, he lacked the legal infrastructure to protect them. The council began to leak documents, spread rumors, and use the law, a tool Leo had only just begun to master, to tie him up in endless bureaucratic red tape. Then came the blow he wasn't prepared for. Arthur's health, already fragile, plummeted under the stress of the mounting tension. The man who had been the architect of Leo's intellect was now confined to a bed, his voice growing thin and rasping. One evening, as a storm rattled the window panes of their small repaired home, Arthur called Leo to his side. He reached out, his hand papery and cold, and gripped Leo's wrist. "The town is changing, Leo," Arthur whispered, his eyes clouded with age, but bright with intent. "But you are still looking at the board like a student. A leader doesn't just solve problems, he anticipates the enemies those solutions create. They've given you a choice, change or lose their grip. They will always choose to keep their grip." "I'm not afraid of them, Arthur," Leo replied, his jaw set. "I know," Arthur sighed. "That is exactly what I am afraid of. Do not let your righteousness become a blindfold." 2 days later, Arthur passed away. The loss wasn't just the death of a mentor, it was the collapse of Leo's world. Without Arthur, the library felt like a tomb. The silence in the house, once a source of comfort, became a deafening reminder of his solitude. Leo fell into a dark period of isolation. He retreated from the public eye. The voice of the voiceless vanished. The council, sensing a vacuum, began to reverse the reforms he had pushed through. They evicted families he had sheltered, and they tore down the makeshift community school he had built, replacing it with a private, gated lot for a new development project. For months, Leo sat in the back of the library, surrounded by Arthur's books, paralyzed by the weight of a singular, biting question. Was it all for nothing? He looked at his calloused hands. He looked at the dust where Arthur drew equations. He realized he had been waiting for a sign, for a feeling, for a spark to return. But he wasn't a boy in the dust anymore.
He was the only person left to hold the map. He stood up, walked to the front door, and locked the library behind him. He didn't go back to the town square to argue. He went to the law firm of the town's wealthiest developer, the man leading the charge against him, and he didn't ask for a meeting. He sat in the lobby every single day for 2 weeks, reading aloud from the town charter, the tax code, and the very laws the developer was breaking. He didn't speak to the guards. He didn't speak to the receptionist. He simply occupied the space, his presence an immovable, quiet protest that disrupted their business day after day. He was showing them that he was still there. He was showing them that his foundation hadn't crumbled. It had simply grown deeper. The town watched. The silence he had learned from Arthur became his loudest weapon. And then, one by one, the people of the lower district began to show up and sit on the floor in that lobby alongside him. The storm was beginning, and this time it wasn't a flood of water, it was a flood of people. We often think that leadership is about making noise, about being the loudest person in the room. But Leo's story reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do to a corrupt system is simply refuse to move. We're approaching the final act of this rise. Are you still with me? If you believe that quiet persistence is a form of power, leave a still standing in the comments. I'm curious, when the world tries to push you out of a space you've earned, how do you hold your ground?
The lobby of the developer's office became a battleground of silence. For days, the only sound was the rustle of pages and the soft rhythmic breathing of people who had been told they didn't matter. The developer, a man named Sterling, tried every tactic. Security guards, threats of arrest, even attempts to bribe Leo with jobs and money. Leo didn't even look up. He had moved past the need for their approval. He was no longer fighting for himself. He was holding the door open for everyone else. The turning point didn't come with a bang. It came with a confession. On the 14th day, Sterling walked out of his office, his face pale and his hands shaking. He looked at the sea of faces sitting on his expensive marble floor, people he had spent his life stepping over. He looked at Leo, who sat at the front, eyes fixed on an old tattered book Arthur had given him. Sterling didn't offer a deal. He didn't make a speech. He simply set a stack of legal documents on the floor in front of Leo. They were the deeds to the land in the lower district, the very land he had planned to redevelop. He had signed them over to a community trust. Leo stood up. He didn't smile in triumph. He didn't gloat. He simply nodded, thanked him with the quiet dignity Arthur had taught him, and walked out. The crowd followed. But the story doesn't end with a signed piece of paper. Years later, the town of Oakhaven was transformed. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. The library where Arthur once taught Leo had become the heart of the town, a place of learning, law, and history. Leo eventually took a seat on the council, but he never moved into the big office. He kept his desk in the middle of the room, accessible to anyone who walked in off the street. He became a legend, not because he defeated his enemies, but because he outlasted them. He showed that you don't need a sword to slay a dragon. Sometimes you just need a better map, and the courage to refuse to move until the world realizes it's standing on the wrong side of history. As for the boy in the dust, he never went away. Every morning, before Leo started his work, he would walk to the edge of the curb where he once sat as a child. He would stand there for a moment, remembering the hunger, the cold, and the sting of being invisible. He used that memory to keep his decisions sharp, his empathy front and center, and his ego in check. He taught everyone who would listen that your origin story isn't your destination, it's your fuel. And the most radical thing you can ever do is believe in your own worth when no one else does. Leo's journey started with a single hand reaching down to pull him up from the dust, and it ended with him lifting an entire town toward the light. We've traveled a long road with him today, from the curb to the council, from the orphan to the architect. But the most important chapter of this story isn't the one I just told. It's the one you're living right now. You have your own Arthur, someone who believed in you, or maybe you're waiting to be that person for someone else. You have your own dust, the hardships that shaped you. Before we close this out, I want you to tell me one thing. What is the one lesson from Leo's life that you're going to carry forward into your own this week? I'll be here, reading your stories. Let's keep building.
You're waiting for the ending, aren't you? The resolution, the happily ever after. But if you've been paying attention to Leo, you know that true transformation doesn't have a final curtain. It's a continuous loop. There is a final unspoken scene in Leo's life, the one that happens after the headlines die down and the cameras stop flashing. Years later, on a quiet Tuesday, an 8-year-old boy is sitting on the curb of a main street in Oakhaven. His clothes are worn, his eyes are tired, and he is staring at the asphalt, watching the world move past him as if he were made of glass. A man stops in front of him. He is older now, his face lined with the maps of his own struggles, his hair dusted with grey. He doesn't look like a politician, he looks like a man who has lived. He doesn't offer money, he doesn't offer a sermon, he simply sits down in the dust next to the boy. He pulls a small worn book from his coat pocket, not a grand manifesto, but a story about a world far beyond Oakhaven. He opens it, waits a beat for the boy to look up, and then he starts to read. Mathematics is the language of the universe, the man says softly, his voice echoing a memory from a dimly lit library. And history is the map of our mistakes. Let's see what we can find in here together. The boy stops looking at the ground. He looks at the man, and for the first time in his life, he sees someone who doesn't just see a stray, but a student. The cycle is complete. The boy who was once cast aside has become the lifeline he once needed. Leo's journey isn't just a story about a boy who made it. It's a blueprint for the ripple effect. You are the product of someone who held space for you, and your ultimate purpose, the most noble thing you can do, is to turn around and hold that same space for someone else. The story of Leo is finished, but yours is still being written. Don't waste the ink. Thank you for walking this path with me. Go out there and be the lifeline someone else is waiting for. We'll talk again soon.